So the presentation is called Reimagining China through Decolonizing Film Curation. So the China here, I'm talking about China as a cultural entity. I'm talking about China as a representation. All right. So the motivation for this project comes from not only from backpack, but also thinking in terms of what the rise of China as a superpower mean for Asia, for different countries around the world, and what it means to curate China. So when you think about the curation of Chinese cinema in terms of the big three, Cannes, Berlin, and Venice Film Festivals, it's always interesting because there are allegations of Orientalism, exhibitionism. So I think it's interesting when we think about China as a post-colonial entity. Right? I think Lydia has dealt with this about the discrepancies and gaps in the way how anti-colonialism and decolonization is understood in different contexts. So I'm trying to boldly consider the possibility of a self-curated film festival program / university module that reimagines China through the critical lenses of decolonization. So I'll be walking you through some themes that we can approach this. So I'll be selecting films from China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United Kingdom from the 1960s to the 2020s for audiences and students to make sense of the interrelationships between Cold War tensions, capital, and cultural production. Right? So I'm trying to connect strands of imperialism, co-ethnic racism. So the idea of co-ethnic racism is always fascinating because you're looking at, for example, discrimination towards mainland Chinese by Hong Kongers, by Taiwanese or Singaporeans, and how this is actually represented in cinema and vice versa. Right? So I'm trying to connect these strands, including Sinophobia, decolonization, through examining how China reimagines itself as the center, looking outwards, and how other countries and territories view the country from outside. So additionally, it also offers a way of understanding ongoing Cold War anxieties towards the Chinese other, not least extends an invitation to more scholars, colleagues to reimagine China from diverse decolonizing perspectives in film curation, if that makes sense. Okay? So, yeah, I don't think I need to talk about this because James and Lydia has covered this. So, like Lydia mentioned, this is a catch-all term. I think I would like to quickly mention Stein and Andreotti's article on decolonization and how education is relevant. Because when we talk about decolonization, we're thinking in terms of many, many issues at once. It can be overwhelming, but we can also use them where appropriate in different contexts for different purposes. So for example, some of the issues I've highlighted in red, I'm not going to read out them, you can see for yourself, right? They may be applied to film curation or rethinking of films from the past, right? So I like to emphasize, it's a set of diverse, ongoing processes rather than a distinct event or set of events. It's a means to a longer-term goal than we get, rather than think of it as an immediate solution or answer. So, and Lydia has mentioned this as well, how Chen has talked about ways forward in ADRS method, how we can problematize neo-colonial, nativist, and binarized anti-colonial frameworks, right? So, thinking about Stein and Andreotti's and Chen's arguments, we might think of how we can actually multiply our frames of references and our subjectivity of and worldview when it comes to curation. So the questions that are drawn from their work then becomes, how can we reimagine China through decolonizing film curation? How can the curation of Asian cinemas critique nationalist impulses, patriarchal transnational capitalism, and gender inequality? Because these are very much tied to colonization in the first place. So when we think about gender equality, that includes misogyny and toxic masculinity, and how these issues might be represented in cinemas. So this is actually quite ambitious, and I think it might not work. It might work. So you tell me. So I'm thinking in terms of themes. When I'm thinking, let's say if I want to create a film festival for an audience who might have an appetite for decolonization, I'm thinking in some students who might be more receptive. Are there themes I can, work on to organize the films? So I've come up with these themes. For example, yellow face and Orientalism, and then anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, xenophobia and co-ethnic racism, Chinese masculinity and global leadership ambitions. So I want to talk quickly about some of the films that might fall into this category. Some of you might be familiar with Griffith's Broken Blossoms. It's quite interesting because Griffith actually made the film The Birth of a Nation. It is one of the most controversial films in American history. It's very racist because it depicts African Americans as very aggressive, unintelligent towards white women. And it is also one of the earliest films that deals with the Ku Klux Klan, as they are represented as a heroic force necessary to preserve American values, protect white women, and maintain white supremacy. So this film, which he made later, seems to be like a redemption of sorts, but it's also problematic because it's got yellow face, got a white actor trying to pass as Chinese. And then you have Charlie Chan series during the 1930s, 40s, and Fu Manchu. So it was adapted from the novels of Sex Roma, made into film, and then The Face of Fu Manchu and The Price of Fu Manchu. So there's a series of Fu Manchu films which is very fascinating. So I'm actually thinking we might be able to revisit some of these very racist, very toxic films from the past and put them in a festival. But that raises another set of issues which I'll come back to later. Right? Now, I'd like to talk about Yellow Face. So Broken Blossoms, it was released during a period of strong anti-Chinese feeling in the USA known as the Yellow Peril. Some of you might be familiar with this. So Alterman, in his recent article on Yellow Face, he talks about how the film actually reuses real-life people into Asian stereotypes. Even though it's well-intended, it's kind of like a progressive counter-programming to the Yellow Peril sweeping America in 1919. So he talks about progressive counter-programming. I think this can be read to level of remembering how Griffith actually made Birth of a Nation before, right? I'm not going to show you this trailer. I think that I found another trailer which is more interesting. Right, so Fu Manchu is this evil, cunning scientist who threatens white civilization. Right, so it personifies Western views of Chinese people. Some of it is still carrying on to this day, like the Chinese scientists lurking somewhere trying to steal Western science secrets, for example. All right, and it is a model for other villains in contemporary Yellow Peril thrillers. Right, Marchetti has talked quite a lot about this. All right, and it imperils white masculinity by adopting white women. Now, this is quite a common trope. So, males of color are often depicted as threatening to white civilization, and it's often the women who get threatened or violated. So we're going to look at this trailer.
The world shall hear from me.
So I have to close. Sorry, how do I toggle? I'm very bad at technology.
You want to do a statement about full screen?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Ah, okay, great.
Why go to all the trouble of kidnapping these women if they're not going to demand a ransom?
They're all very beautiful women.
Quite safe traffic, although they always go for unknowns. They've kidnapped 11 women in 18 months in 10 different countries, Petrie.
Oh, there's one comfort. There's been no kidnapping here, so we don't have to worry about it.
I think it is Fu Manchu. Can he still be alive?
I don't know, Petrie. The important thing is to be in time to save that girl.
Starring Christopher Lee as Dr. Fu Manchu.
This is the destiny of Fu Manchu.
Douglas Wilmer as Nayland Smith. Heinz Drucker as Franz Baumer, who tried to outwit the craftiest criminal alive.
I think you get the idea. So, okay, I'll practice. Right, so, yeah. So that was an example of yellow face and Orientalism. And I'm going to move on to the next theme, which is anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. So you might be familiar with Bruce Lee's Fist of Fury and Enter the Dragon in the 1970s. So this was a period when nationalism was still going strong. Lots of countries became independent. A lot of Commonwealth countries became independent in the 1950s and 60s. But still there is a strong sense of humiliation that's often depicted in films. And Bruce Lee embodies this anxiety and this aspiration to become a strong nation for China. And then there's also this very interesting film called Reimagining, 1987. This is one of the rare occasions where the Chinese government and the liberal capitalist West see eye to eye when it comes to defining what constitutes a good film. In 1987, Zhang Yimou's Red Sodom won the Golden Bear Berlin Film Festival. So but this film is also very much about anti-Japanese imperialism. Right? So we are looking at films across different eras, but with overlapping themes on anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. I think the case of Bruce Lee is always interesting to revisit. Of course, in Fist of Fury, there's this iconic scene where Bruce Lee tries to enter a building that says "No dogs and Chinese allowed," and then he does a flying kick, he destroys the sign, and then he also returns the calligraphy given by Japanese, the Chinese, that talks about China being the sick man of Asia. So these four characters, Dong Yao Bingfu actually reads as a sick man of Asia. So this is where he destroys the signs and humiliates his Japanese opponents. So it talks about the film actually represents anti-Japanese sentiment, but at the same time it's a very good example of how Chinese people can unite and resist colonialism. And then you also have Enter the Dragon in 1973. It illustrated strong connections between racism and colonialism, with explicit mentions of police targeting black individuals and the emergence of the black martial arts movement. Well, there are issues, if we look at these films today, there are issues of Japanese face. For example, you have Chinese people trying to pass off as Japanese, doing stock characters in Fist of Fury. You also have brown face, for example, when Bruce Lee tries to enter the building where it says "No dogs and Chinese allowed." This Chinese person trying to pass off as a Sikh person, security guards standing in front of the building, right? So, Charles Joyce's important article about Bruce Lee's inspiration to a lot of the black exploitation films at that era, I think is worth looking at. So he talks about how African Americans are fractions of kung fu movies and the social relations of domination and resistance as embodied by these films, especially in how it deals with the dialectical relationship between Black racial oppression and the Black freedom movement. So Bruce Lee was in fact a figure of inspiration for a lot of Black communities during the time. And now I move on to the third theme, which is xenophobia and co-ethnic racism. So this is always interesting. As a Singaporean Chinese, I think it's interesting for me because when I look back at some of the films that were produced from the 1980s to even quite recently, all the way from Hong Kong to Singapore. So when you look at 1983, this was a time when there was anxiety in Hong Kong. Hong Kong people were feeling the anxiety of being the British handover to China. So very often the Chinese other, I'm talking about the Chinese other from mainland China, is represented as a working class woman. All right, not very intelligent, but however, this film, Home at Hong Kong, represents the Chinese woman in a more sympathetic light. All right, I don't have time to go into details, but we're looking at a diverse range of different representations. So I'd like to highlight the series Her Fatal Ways. So we have the Chinese woman who's represented as a police officer from China collaborating with Hong Kong police to fight the Hong Kong mafia. And it's often a very soft character where she's, very old-fashioned, very conservative. She's like espousing the values of the Communist Party, all right? And she needs like the Hong Kong man to help us become more attractive and beautiful. So there's always this unequal relationship that's represented in between, if we look at Hong Kong men and Chinese women at the time. And then in 1997, a very important Singapore film that dealt with this Chinese stereotype is 12 Stories. So this is interesting. I'm going to be talking about this shortly. And then as recent as 2016, there's still this stock character, right? So I've come up with some of the observations that includes, for example, in Singapore cinema, you have tropes of working class women from China, often featured as KTV hostesses and prostitutes. And then 12 Stories, for example, there's popular imagination of the Chinese woman as money-grabbing, tap interest who causes the downfall of Singapore men. All right? And it's interesting because, for example, in 12 Stories, the Chinese woman is not given a face at the beginning. It's close-up of her different body parts as she's showering. This is the first impression that she makes to audiences. So she's being objectified, almost treated as a non-human object before she's given a face on screen. And she's played by a Taiwanese actor who's based in Singapore. And then in Lulu the movie, she's played by a Singapore character. So don't you notice that there's a parallel here? Can the subaltern speak? It's always being played by not the person itself, but someone trying to demonize the other. So the last theme I'd like to introduce would be militarized Chinese masculinity and global leadership ambitions. So this pertains to the issue of when we think about China as a rising superpower, there are an interesting series of films that talks about strong men trying to do real business in Africa and also trying to save the world. From Wolf Warrior 2, in fact, there was like Wolf Warrior 1, I'll not go there, 2016 all the way to 2021. So if you look at some of these films, very often there's parallels between Rambo. Rambo tries to rehabilitate white American masculinity in the Vietnam War, is saving hostages, held by the enemy. So, and Bruce Lee, okay, where he tries to glorify, Chinese masculinity through anti-colonialism. And then Lung Feng, the protagonist in Warrior 2, there's this assertion of China's newfound confidence and global leadership ambitions. Don't you find it interesting that I must always show my torso to make a point? So there's exposure of the male body that's often muscularized and militarized. Right? So while I like to be a bit more nuanced here, because while Bruce Lee was conscious of his allyship with people of color, especially the black community, Leung Feng actually saw himself as the savior of Africa. Alright, I'm going to show you this in a bit. So this is where I talk about how China can be represented as Godfather in World War II. So you have Leung Feng, the protagonist, embodying China's nationalist and transnational capitalist drives, okay, through his aggrandized masculinity. So he's depicted as a skillful football player, perhaps as a way of rehabilitating China's rather abysmal football team, right? And then he's someone who can hold his liquor very well, because a true man must be able to drink a lot. And then is seen as a savior of black people. And I find this very fascinating. This is where he is actually quite misogynist. So I'll give you some examples. This is one of the earliest scenes where he plays football with an African community here. So these are his friends, and the way he interacts with them seems almost like they're very good friends. But look at some of the displays of masculinity. Oops. Oh, I must grab this again. Okay, this is where civil war begins, and then we have the Chinese rebel. Alright, and then this is the scene where he can hold his liquor. Alright, it's interesting because you hear the locals calling him something. Anyway, he wins, yeah, so that's the way to see it. Okay. And then we have him doing something quite interesting here, so we'll see this. Now, you remember, like, Civil War happened? So China is working very closely with the UN to evacuate people who are under siege, who are suffering from the war, all right? So, and there are affected factory workers as well. So, this is Dr. Rachel, who's mixed British Chinese. She's trying to do her best to treat people who are injured.
你看你上飞机，
还有很多人需要我帮助。
女人孩子都得上飞机。
在这里我不是女人，我是医生。在这里我比你专业。
论保护人，我比你专业。
Pasha, you ready to go on a helicopter? Because this is Gospels.
Get out of the helicopter. 别给我添乱，好不好？
不好意思。
什么事？
我
Okay, so you've seen enough. Yeah. So, yeah, thinking about these films, I'm thinking, so what comes next? This very recent film, sorry, this should be 2021, The Battle of Lake Changjin. So this is directed and co-produced by Chen Kaige. So some of you might familiar with Chen Kaige, who actually produced very good films during the 1980s, and he was a regular at Berlin, Cannes, and Venice during that time. All right, you also have Hong Kong film directors and producers working on the project as well. So it's commissioned by the Central Propaganda Department of the Chinese Communist Party as party's 100th anniversary celebrations. It talks about the Korean War. So it talks about the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's alliance with North Korea, forcing the US forces to withdraw in a fictionalized retelling of the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War. Now, this is the most expensive film produced ever, with a budget of $200 million. All right, yeah, so you can read the details here. Now, this is interesting for me because I feel that we're looking at, Lydia was talking about anti-colonialism in a different context, how this decolonization is problematic in other contexts, right? So we're looking at a very specific historical event that talks about anti-colonialism because for the Chinese people, the Americans are seen as colonizers, imperialists, all right? So that's from the Chinese perspective. Yeah, so we are representing this historical event and embodying it with concerns of contemporary superpower with global ambitions. And it's also one of the very good examples of how China sees itself as the only worthy opponent to American dominance in the world. All right? So again, I have this interest in ongoing Cold War tensions. I think this film precisely depicts that. Yeah. So conclusions. How can film curation of Asian cinemas critique nationalist impulses, patriarchal, transnational capitalism, gender equality? So I think we need to engage with these films, even though they are not very nice to watch. I mean, at least personally. I have to watch the same film over and over again in different contexts, and I sometimes try to think, how can I reframe this? How can I not be judgmental and help my students understand these films in a different light, for example, in a critical light at least. And again, I like to emphasize how multiple frames of references and also considering the concerns, including anti-colonialism and the gaps between with decolonization might be important when it comes to thinking about decolonizing the curation of films. So, for me, I think it's important that we be self-reflexive, critical, and collaborative. So, can film curators, educators, and filmmakers come together to offer different, even if they are in contestation, even if you don't agree with one another what decolonization means, can we put together different films and raise questions if we believe that it's an ongoing, long process? So in the context of anti-woke and cancel culture, how should film festivals and universities screen politically questionable films and engage with the general public, film audiences and students, including, for example, The Birth of a Nation, including Broken Blossoms. So I don't have answers to these, but I working on this project made me think about more questions than I have answers to. Thank you very much.